Welcome, everyone, to the second installment of the 45th Annual Midwest Philosophy Colloquium on the topic of the philosophy of conspiracy theory. We are very excited to welcome tonight our speaker, MRX Dentith, who is an associate professor currently at Beijing Normal University in China. M is the author of The Philosophy of Conspiracy Theories, the first single-authored book on the philosophy of conspiracy theory, and also the editor of a collection entitled Taking Conspiracy Theories Seriously. He also co-hosts a fabulous podcast called The Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy. Tonight, and we'll be talking about the ethics of conspiracy theorizing in the age of the novel coronavirus. So I'll turn things over to you.
Hello there. So I should point out I'm at Beijing Normal University, but not actually at Beijing Normal University. I've yet to actually get to China due to this pesky pandemic, which of course is causing a lot of trouble for people all around the globe. And actually, part of the reason why I'm giving this particular talk is that the novel coronavirus has been quite interesting for those of us working in the field of the philosophy of conspiracy theory, as I'm going to explain around about now. So at the moment, we kind of are facing two pandemics. There's the literal viral pandemic, which is the novel coronavirus, COVID-19. And then there appears to be a glut of unwarranted conspiracy theories concerning the origin, transmission, purpose, and deadliness of COVID-19, and even some conspiracy theories which question whether COVID-19 is a very real thing. And this has been interesting from the point of view of the particularists in the philosophy of conspiracy theory, because as Brian talked about in his talk 3 weeks ago, particularism has basically become the default thesis in the philosophy of conspiracy theory. The idea that we cannot just dismiss conspiracy theories as a class and treat them as prima facie false or typically irrational to believe. Rather, that because we know conspiracies occur and some pejoratively labeled conspiracy theories have turned out to be true, then we basically have to start going around assessing conspiracy theories on the evidence rather than simply dismissing them because they've been labeled as a conspiracy theory. Now, Mark actually raised a really interesting, actually, no, sorry, Brian raised a really interesting question in his piece 3 weeks ago, which is there is something quite odd about the philosophy of conspiracy theories in general, which is that there are an awful lot of Antipodean philosophers who are heavily involved in this project, and we're kind of crowding out or outnumbering the philosophers found elsewhere. So we've got Steve Clark, who's on this panel today. We've got Charles Pigden, who's also here. We have David Cody, who we'll be hearing from in a few weeks' time. There's Neil Levy, there's Pat Stokes, and there's myself. There's a large number of Antipodeans who are doing work on the philosophy of conspiracy theory. It is kind of interesting that there are a lot of us around. Now, Charles, I think, has a rather serious answer as to why Antipodean philosophers are so interested in conspiracy theory. I've got a somewhat more jocular hypothesis about this, and this is largely relegated to the Aotearoa New Zealand context, although I think this will probably apply in the Australian context as well. I think one of the reasons why philosophers and the Antipodes are so interested in political philosophy, and particularly how conspiracy theories work, is that we come from political cultures where we're kind of told by our political elites that actually we're small countries. The number of connections between us and our political masters is actually quite tight. So most of us have either met the prime minister or had their shopping trolley stolen by them from the shopping trolley stolen from them by the prime minister in a supermarket. That's actually a true story in my respect. And so because our political cultures are taken to be so tiny, and so tight-knit, it's really not likely that conspiracies are occurring here. So we might as well look overseas and be really interested in what's happening in Russia, or what's really happening in the US, or what's really happening in the UK. So I think there's actually something about the political culture here which makes us very interested in what's on in politics overseas, which has led to a lot of us being really interested in how conspiracy theories work. And from the distance we have in the kind of the end of the world, being able to judge those conspiracy theories on the evidence. Now, I'm not saying this is a great explanation, but I do think it kind of feeds into the kind of political culture that leads people to be interested in conspiracy theories here. We're so far away from the terrible conspiracies those of you in the Northern Hemisphere seem to commit on a day-by-day basis. So that's my jocular attempt to try to explain why it is there are so many Antipodeans involved in this panel. Now, what's interesting from my perspective as a philosopher who works on conspiracy theories is that 2020 and arguably 2021, as we look into the future, presents what appears to be, on the face of it, a bit of a quandary. Because my PhD thesis was entitled In Defense of Conspiracy Theories. My first book, The Philosophy of Conspiracy Theories, argued for particularism, the idea that we must assess conspiracy theories on the evidence, and thus we cannot simply dismiss them as a class as prima facie false or typically irrational. But what's particularly interesting in the era of the novel coronavirus is that I've been invited by governmental and non-governmental groups to comment and analyze a variety of COVID-19 conspiracy theories circulating in our local context here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and provide, using medicalized terms, kind of inoculations or interventions to stop people from believing these unwarranted conspiracy theories, because there's a worry that in the age of COVID-19, people who believe conspiracy theories will change their behaviors, and once people start changing their behaviors, the virus is going to more easily spread. And when I was thinking about the role that I'm currently playing in our local context, kind of debating and analyzing the kind of conspiracy theories we've been seeing spread online, I realized that there's another recurrent issue that I've encountered as someone who nominally defends conspiracy theories, which is that every time I'm asked by journalists, what's the wackiest conspiracy theory you believe? I end up going, well, I mean, I suppose if you want to talk about conspiracy theories, I do believe. I mean, I do believe that the US and the UK conspired to fabricate evidence that those weapons of mass destruction were in Iraq back in 2003. But what journalists want is for me to endorse some version of a 9/11 inside job conspiracy theory, or claim that I don't think that Lee Harvey Oswald killed Kennedy, or some claim that I believe that the moon is actually a lunar base, or that the earth is hollow. It turns out I don't seem to be a conspiracy theorist in the pejorative sense of believing these wonderful, weird, and what most people seem to think of as unwarranted, irrational conspiracy theories. And yet I go about in my work saying, actually, we should at least be suspicious that conspiracies are occurring. And so it occurred to me that obviously there's something going on when I'm looking at conspiracy theories, and that I'm defending the idea that we should conspiracy theorize and actually ask questions about whether there are conspiracies going on. And yet, my reaction to most of the weird and wacky conspiracy theories that people are concerned with is to show the same degree of skepticism that people who are arch conspiracy skeptics appear to engage in. So this paper is kind of a way of me working through my own personal issues about how I view particularism and the work I'm doing over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic in the local context of Aotearoa, New Zealand, as well as a way of synthesizing the literature to show that actually this quandary isn't really much of a quandary at all once we start looking at what philosophers have actually said about things. Because you might take the quandary to be this, there's a particular peril to being a particularist. You might think that there's a recurrent issue in philosophy, that many philosophers are armchair philosophers. They sit in their chairs, they hypothesize about an issue, they crank the issue through their particular methodology, and then they come up with a conclusion without ever interacting with the real world or being concerned with the fact that sometimes when we're doing political philosophy, we're not just thinking about abstract concepts, we're talking about people, feelings, affect, intention, and the like, and the fact that our conclusions sometimes need to take into account how people feel about the world. And the conspiracy theory stuff here is interesting because the particularist who simply goes, we should analyze every single conspiracy theory according to the evidence, might be seen to be quite cavalier when we're advocating that position in the midst of a pandemic, because there are social costs to there being conspiracy theories about COVID-19. In that, if you are someone who thinks that there's something suspicious about the origin, the transmission, the deadliness, or the existence of COVID-19, then you are probably the kind of person who is less likely to wear a mask, less likely to engage in social distancing, and now probably less likely to want to take a vaccine for COVID-19. So there's a worry that there are social costs to these conspiracy theories existing in the polis right now. And it seems a bit weird that people like me go, but we should probably be concerned about the idea that there are conspiracies or cover-ups going on in the background. So is particularism just another example of armchair work that ignores the lived experience of others, which is a recurrent complaint about contemporary philosophy, particularly over the course of the 20th century, and now it would seem, given we're 1/5 of the way through the 21st. But it's important to note, having said this, that not every COVID-19 conspiracy theory that we hear about turns out to be implausible. And here are two examples. So it's plausible to think that certain governments may have engaged in cover-ups when it came to their initial response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's plausible to think that governments are engaging in trying to conspire or hide the fact that their initial response wasn't particularly good, or that it took them a lot longer to get up to speed on an issue, or they were advised about the dangers of COVID-19 and failed to act upon it for several weeks or months. And so you can imagine that there are conspiracy theories about what did the government actually know and when did they act and how negligent were they, and are they trying to cover that up to make themselves look good? Conversely, there are also very interesting questions about the people who are funding particular groups which are anti-lockdown, anti-mask, and pro the use of health supplements as a curative or cure-all for COVID-19. And actually, what's kind of interesting about this latter type of conspiracy theory is that a lot of people are taking that conspiracy theory seriously now, and yet many people do not want to talk about that as being we're putting forward a conspiracy theory. They simply want to say this is a concern we need to investigate because we're concerned of the consequences of this dark money doing its thing. But that is someone taking a conspiracy theory seriously and investigating it. And so I think it's quite interesting from the perspective of the work I've been doing over the last year and a bit, that there are conspiracy theories on what we might say both sides of the aisle, but people often don't really want to talk about that fact. So the worry really, when we're talking about conspiracy theories being spread during the age of the novel coronavirus, are these unwarranted conspiracy theories, which Brian talked about 3 weeks ago, and I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But first, I want to talk about the scale of the problem. Because if you watch the media or you talk to government advisors, people will say we are in a glut of conspiracy theories about COVID-19. There are lots of them. They are having a massive effect upon the population, and we need to do something about them. But the problem is, it's not actually entirely clear that there are any more conspiracy theories now than there were 2 years ago before the pandemic started. And the reason why I can make that claim is that you've got people like Joe Usinski, a political scientist at the University of Miami, who does work for the Pew Research Center, who's been doing surveys on conspiracy theory belief for over 10 years now, and he is not seeing any demonstrable uptick in belief in conspiracy theories at this point in time. So one example which Joe talks about in his work are conspiracy theories about the US election, and he's been very interested in looking into the QAnon phenomenon, which, if you believe the media, is a big threat towards the democratic politics in the US. And yet, according to Joe's research data, only less than 10% of the American population even knows what QAnon is. And then of that less than 10%, only a tiny percentage of that know anything in particular about QAnon, which indicates that QAnon is both not popular and there probably aren't that many people who actually believe the conspiracy theory. So we might be dealing with a notability problem here, in that the media is talking a lot about these conspiracy theories because they're unusual and weird, but there actually might not be that many of them. Of course, conversely, you might go, well, actually, the numbers don't really matter here. What really matters is how pernicious, I'm fairly sure I've just mispronounced it, how pernicious, which is a much better pronunciation of that word, how pernicious these conspiracy theories are as beliefs. Because it doesn't really matter how prevalent or notable they are, it's whether people believe and act upon these theories. Because often when we're talking about belief in conspiracy theories, we are sometimes being ambiguous between two different ideas. Because not everybody who believes a conspiracy theory is committed to it being warranted according to the evidence. Sometimes we simply entertain conspiracy theories for fun and frolics, or sometimes we use them to irritate our interlocutors by pretending to believe them and trolling people. Sometimes people are just merely suspicious that there's something odd in the world, and they're going to consider a conspiracy theory as a potential explanation of the way the world is, without actually being committed to it being true. So this is a kind of weak belief. They are simply entertaining a variety of different theories which would explain weirdness or oddities in the world. But actually, it turns out if you push them on it, they'll go, well, it's something which I'm suspicious about, but I really wouldn't believe. You can't press me to say I think it's absolutely true. I'm just willing to consider it. And some people really are committed to their chosen conspiracy theories being true, which is a kind of strong belief. And part of the problem with the surveying we're seeing on belief in conspiracy theories is that it's not easy to detect whether someone has strong or weak belief in a conspiracy theory, or simply knows about a conspiracy theory because they're interested in weird ideas, but actually have no real belief in them being warranted. So this is kind of the edge case here of trying to work out just how pernicious these beliefs are, given that there's an ambiguity between strong and weak belief in these things in the first place. And I won't deal too much with that because there's an awful lot to get through. Because when we're interested in looking at how people talk about conspiracy theories, we tend to be construing these peoples as having strong belief. But of course, what's interesting about the pandemic is that people who are only mildly suspicious that there is something odd about the COVID-19 story might still change their behavior. So if you're the kind of person who has a really strong belief that COVID-19 is a hoax, then you are the kind of person who is going to attend a mass protest about lockdown or mask mandates in your state, which is bad because given COVID-19 is real, you are suddenly exposing yourself to a whole variety of vectors for COVID-19 infection. Or if you are infectious with COVID-19, now spreading it to a whole bunch of other people. But even if you only think there's something suspicious about the story that's been told by your government or by medical professionals about COVID-19, then you're probably more likely to go, maybe I don't need to wear a mask when I take public transport. Maybe I don't need to stand 6 feet or 2 meters away from someone when I'm in a queue. And maybe I'll just wait slightly longer to see what's happening with these vaccines before I get vaccinated, which, because the virus doesn't care about your feelings or thoughts whatsoever, is going to go, well, that's great. I can just spread to my heart's content, because you may not really be committed to the conspiracy theory being true, but you're still acting in such a way that actually your behavior has changed and you're now a delightful vector for me to infect more and more people. That's me putting intentionality onto a mindless virus there, but that's the kind of thing you think about when you are so immersed in thinking about conspiracy theories about these things the entire time. Even the virus itself seems to be conspiring against humanity. So the perniciousness of these beliefs is actually really quite interesting. And it's the kind of thing which motivates so much of the governmental and NGO response to conspiracy theories over the course of the pandemic, and that there is this worry that people are believing these things, and we need to find a way to demonstrate to people that they should not treat these particular conspiracy theories seriously. Now, philosophers have been quite attentive to the problem of unwarranted belief in conspiracy theories. And so I want to kind of go through what philosophers have said about our approach to particular kinds of conspiracy theory and why we sometimes have grounds for a suspicion of conspiracy theories which take a particular form. And I'm going to be presenting some work by people who are actually in the panel tonight. So both Charles and Brian's work I'm going to touch upon. I won't be touching upon Steve's work, and that his work does appear in a section of the paper version of this talk, but unfortunately doesn't get to feature in this version of the talk. Steve can always present his particular view if he wants during the Q&A. There might be a good question for someone to ask. But it turns out that philosophers have been interested in there being a problematic class of conspiracy theories which have particular features, whilst also advocating that we still need to do some amount of investigation into these theories, because just because we find the theory suspicious doesn't mean it might not be happening. Someone needs to actually have that conversation. And I'm going to talk at the very end of this presentation about one way we can do that and how we can sidestep some of the issues that people have with the public talk of conspiracy theory. So I'll come back to that towards the end of this talk. So let me just dive straight in and talk about a variety of different mechanisms that philosophers have put forward for saying, look, there are some conspiracy theories that you are allowed to be suspicious of on first glance, even though technically you need someone to investigate them further. Now, the first one I'm going to talk about is a concept put forward by Juha Riker and Lee Basham, who say, look, there are simply some conspiracy theories out there which are fantastical. So they're so weird, they're so bizarre, that we can, in fact, reject them a priori because of their fantastical nature. Now, I'm assuming everyone here is attending this talk because they're interested in the phenomenon of conspiracy theories, so don't need to go into any particular depth about the idea that there are people out there who believe the world is controlled by alien shape-shifting reptiles. So you might go, well, look, that's fantastical. That's so outlandish and weird that we should just go, look, there's no point even entertaining a belief which is so unusual. But we need to note there's actually a variety of different senses of fantastical which is operating here when we start talking about fantastical conspiracy theories. There are fantastical conspiracy theories that go beyond the available evidence or wisdom of the day. So they posit things that we simply do not think exist, like alien shape-shifting reptiles. And then there are theories which are fantastical because they're simply false according to the available evidence. They present mechanisms that do not exist, and thus they are fantastical because they are extraordinary in a kind of supernatural or non-material sense. So theories which are fantastical in the first sense turn out to not necessarily be false. They're simply implausible given the available evidence. We do not think that alien shape-shifting reptiles exist. But of course, the whole point of the alien shape-shifting reptile conspiracy theory is that they are hiding their existence from people like you or me. So of course, there's not going to be any available evidence of their existence. These alien shape-shifting reptiles are actually out there, but they're making sure that we can't spot these things. So someone still needs to sit down and go, when David Icke, who's the most famous proponent of the alien shape-shifting reptile hypothesis, puts forward what he takes to be the circumstantial evidence that shows us that actually we should believe in these things, someone should sit down and go, right, I mean, they are fantastical, but what if Icke is right? Because if it turns out if we are controlled by alien shape-shifting reptiles who, for example, eat babies and drink human blood and make up the majority of the political establishment in the US and the UK, we probably want to put a stop to that. That's the kind of thing that we don't really want to be around. So just because something goes against our view of the world, that's a reason to be cautious, but it doesn't necessarily tell us that these theories are false. It simply says, look, they're suspicious because they don't fit the way we think the world is. But of course, if the conspiracy is true, then that's what the conspirators want us to believe in the first place. And then there are, of course, those theories which are fantastical because they're counter to the evidence. Now, theories which are counter to the evidence are theories, of course, which rest upon, when you actually look at the conspiracy theories themselves, theories which rest upon disputed evidence or arguments which use evidence in unusual ways. So often when we say a conspiracy theory like the 9/11 inside job that says that 9/11 was committed by elements within the United States, planting explosives, say, in the Twin Towers to bring them down, it's not that we've got obvious claims of evidence which are false. What we have are inferences based upon the interpretation of the evidential record, in which one theory goes in one direction and another theory goes in another direction. So often these fantastical conspiracy theories aren't prima facie counter to the evidence. Rather, they're counter to the lens that particular people have given the theory they already believe. And there's a whole bunch to be said here about the Duhem-Quine thesis and the way that evidence doesn't determine theories, but theories by and large determine what we take to be evidence. And so it turns out it's not easy to simply say we should treat these things suspiciously because they're counter to the evidence, because actually evidence is a lot more sophisticated than that. But I think there is an interesting subset here of the fantastical conspiracy theory, which I take to be the inconceivable conspiracy theory. Because some theories are fantastical in a really odd way. They refer to things which could happen, but don't happen. So it's just inconceivable to think of the conspiracy theory working because it could be the case, but it just turns out every time we look, it really isn't the case. And the example I was thinking about at a conference earlier this week down in Otago is this notion of mind control technology, which we're seeing around COVID-19. So some people are of the firm belief that Bill Gates, possibly literally Bill Gates himself, is going to inject microchips into the back of our neck and use that to enact mind control. And people go, look, this is what the liberals want. They want to be able to control the very way you think. And as we were discussing at a conference on social media during the age of COVID-19 and what happened after the events in Christchurch 2 years ago with the terrorist shootings, people have pointed out that there's something really weird about these views, in that we could actually expect the social media giants like Twitter and Facebook to enact actually quite draconian speech controls if they want to. We know, for example, that in the political state of Germany, both Twitter and Facebook have algorithms which are used to detect Nazi speech and make sure that it never gets published to the platform. And so there's this open question. Why aren't Twitter and Facebook, when we know they can do it in one nation state, using that in all nation states to stop the spread of white supremacism and white nationalism, which is something they claim to be in support of? So it turns out it's conceivable that they could do this thing. It turns out they never do. And so you end up going, well, if they're not doing it in the realm of social media, why think they're going to do the same thing when it comes to hypothetical mind control technology? There just doesn't seem to be the political will to do the thing that we know is actually logically possible. So the problem with these inconceivable conspiracy theories is that we have evidence that people are reluctant to do something they could do, paired then with the impossible technology, these little mind control chips using nanotechnology, which somehow also can receive radio signals and have an infinite battery life. These appear to be inconceivable conspiracy theories. And that then led to the idea that we also get a similar case here with what we might call the slippery slope conspiracy theory. The idea that there are certain conspiracy theories that say, look, this innocuous change, which is going on right now, is actually the kind of thing that's going to lead to some absolute disaster down the line, which is precisely what the shadowy cabal in control of the world wants. They want you to think it's a series of benign changes, but it's the destruction of Western civilization that we're about to encounter. And we've seen a variety of different versions of that recently. We've got the current claim that seems to be all the vogue in the UK, that granting transgender people equal rights is part of a plot to destroy the basis of Western civilization. It's just one small step, and soon it'll be cats marrying dogs and rhinos being in charge of the US. Actually, I now realize that using rhino, I was using rhino there with respect to the animal, not rhino in American political slang. It's one of these things I should probably keep in mind. But we've seen similar versions of that over the course of the 20th century. The suffragette movement was used as a motivation. You know, you might give women the vote now, but by the end of the century, it's just going to be nuclear war everywhere. It seems to be these innocuous changes are part of the conspiracy to bring about this really undesirable endpoint. Now, anyone who knows anything about slippery slope arguments will go, well, look, slippery slope arguments are not inherently fallacious. They're only fallacious if the overall likelihood of the series of predicted outcomes obtaining turns out to be unlikely, or the principle being stated behind the series of changes has been expressed in a bad way. Now, of course, also it turns out that working out whether the chain is likely or unlikely, or how we should actually pass or understand that principle, is difficult, because once again, we're dealing with complex social claims, and these complex social claims do not render themselves easily to a pure mathematical understanding with respect to what's the likelihood of this change leading to this change without there being unpredicted outcomes. And the kind of principles that people use to explain these things, of course, are going to be seen through the lens of your political ideology. If you're a conservative, then extending rights to oppress minorities may well be a threat to how you think the world should work. If you're a liberal, extending rights to oppress minorities simply seems like a no-brainer. You're trying to bring those people up to the same level you are. So once again, this gives us a reason to be suspicious of certain conspiracy theories because of the way they're expressed, but it doesn't actually tell us that they are necessarily false. Now I'm going to move on to the work of Brian Keeley, who back in 1999 expressed the idea of the mature conspiracy theory. So Brian has argued that there's a class of conspiracy theory that we are justified in being skeptical of because these theories are mature. And by mature here, I like to use the analogy of they're like a stinky cheese or a really smelly egg, in that their maturity is a reason for us to be suspicious of them. Although it turns out that actually sometimes a stinky cheese is going to be delicious, and sometimes a smelly egg is the result of a maturation process which belongs to a particular type of cuisine, and actually that shows you the egg is actually really good to eat. I also want to point out that I'm a vegan making these analogies, so I don't really know that much about cheese or eggs, but I've read about these things in books. I believe it's a sound analogy. So a mature conspiracy theory is a conspiracy theory which has been investigated. People have looked into it, and yet it's managed to persist over time. Now, the problem is if you have an unwarranted conspiracy theory which has persisted over time, so it's matured, then that gives us grounds to be suspicious of it. Because either no one's ever put forward enough evidence to show that we should believe the conspiracy theory, which is one sense of unwarranted, it simply failed to gain warrant over time, or there's a body of evidence which is contrary to the conspiracy theory. So it seems it really wouldn't be sensible to believe it, but yet for some reason it's persisted in public discourse. So that's why we can be suspicious of these theories. They've either failed to gain adequate evidence to show that we should believe them, or conversely, there's lots of evidence against them, and yet somehow there are still some people out there taking that claim seriously. But as I noted, part of the issue there is that sometimes it is going to turn out that while there was no evidence for the theory here and now, new evidence might come to light that shows you that the theory actually is good. Watergate's actually a great example of that. When you actually look at the research that Woodward and Bernstein put into it, it's about 3 years before there's actually enough large-scale evidence to persuade the public that actually something really weird did go down in the break-in to the Democratic National headquarters. And sometimes it turns out that actually the evidence against the theory actually may have been manufactured by the conspirators themselves. So they've deliberately put out disinformation into the world to dissuade you that the conspiracy theory is true, as Stalin did with the mock trials back in the 1930s. They put out disinformation to make it look as if the mock trials were in fact real trials after all. Now, there's a problem when we talk about maturity, in that it's a little bit vague as to exactly when a theory becomes mature. Now, Brian, in his 1999 paper, talks about the Oklahoma City bombings, which had only occurred a few years prior. I have, in discussion with him, pinged him for declaring the Oklahoma City bombing conspiracy theory as mature so quickly after the event. And yet I have to admit I'm doing exactly the same thing with a whole bunch of COVID-19 conspiracy theories, even though they are a lot younger. And this is because what counts as mature ends up being vague. Sometimes maturity is it persists for a long time, despite there being some investigation of the claim and the theory being found wanting. Sometimes maturity is because it hasn't existed for particularly long, but there's been an awful lot of investigation into the conspiracy theory, and that has led people to go, oh, I mean, surely we would have found the evidence by this particular point in time. So maturity here does end up being vague, but I think it's something which can be passed out by talking about the way that we think theories are warranted or unwarranted. But the crucial point is that maturity never tells us that a theory is false. It simply tells us that we should be suspicious of the theory in the absence of other available evidence at time X, because sometimes moldy cheeses or stinky eggs will turn out to be edible after all. Now, Charles Pigton, in a recent work, and by recent work, I'm talking all the way back to 2018, when he submitted a wonderful chapter to the edited collection Taking Conspiracy Theories Seriously, has talked about the notion of the defectible conspiracy. The idea that there are certain conspiracies which are defectible if the cost of defection is low and the rewards of defecting from the conspiracy is high. And a conspiracy theory suffers from defectability if the conspiracy that it postulates turns out to be a defectible one. Oh, sorry, I've jumped ahead ever so slightly there. Now, defectability is something which is going to be context dependent. If you're, say, someone who was involved in the conspiracy to give the election to Donald Trump, and so you are a crucial part of the conspiracy, you could reveal to the world exactly what you did. You're probably, if Donald Trump had managed to win the election last year, not going to defect, because there's no particular benefit of revealing to the world that your boss has been brought in inappropriately, because it's quite possible that your boss, with the powers of the state behind him, is going to make the cost of your defection actually quite high, and the rewards of your defection, even if they are relatively high in the short term, probably not particularly good in the long term. Whilst conversely, revealing this fact to President Joe Biden in the here and now, the costs of defection are low, and the reward you'll get for finally giving evidence of this particular conspiracy are going to be high. Now, in personal correspondence, Charles and I have talked about how there are a whole bunch of other confounding factors going on here. If there are watch keepers over the conspiracy who are going to execute anyone who even looks as if they're about to defect, then even if technically the cost of defection are low in a kind of society-wide fashion, they actually might be incredibly high on a personal fashion. But even so, if your conspiracy is defectible, your posited conspiracy is defectible, then your conspiracy theory can at least be pinged for the vice of defectibility, at which point you go, look, here's another reason why we can be suspicious of certain particular conspiracy theories, even though, once again, we can't actually say that they are necessarily false. Now, I've taught in my work a lot about recurrent conspiracy theory narratives. Sometimes we end up rejecting particular conspiracy theories because they appear to be simply another instance of a theory that we've already dismissed or had grounds to be suspicious of. That is, they are recurrent conspiracy theory narratives. Now, just because a theory resembles an already known to be bad theory doesn't tell us it's necessarily false, because a theory can resemble an older theory, but the new theory can rely on novel evidence or new arguments, which then need to be checked out. The hypothetical I think of in this respect is climate change conspiracy theories. For a long time, people have been claiming that there's been a conspiracy in the field of climatology to make it look as if anthropogenic climate change is an imminent threat to the human species. And this is a recurrent narrative we see again and again and again every time scientists talk about the dangers of climate change, because, oh, it's just all part of a large-scale conspiracy by the scientific endeavor. Now, these theories have been investigated and found wanting, but it's not impossible to think that tomorrow a whole bunch of climatologists get together and go, look, we've been trying to persuade the humans that actually they're burning their planet up, and it hasn't worked. So from today, we are going to exaggerate all of our claims, engage in hyperbole, and fabricate data in the hope that this time, if we make it look as if the danger is so imminent, they'll finally get around to doing it. So this theory would resemble the previous unwarranted conspiracy theories about anthropogenic climate change, but this would actually be a new theory saying, look, from time X onwards, that's the point in time to be suspicious about the available data. And that's why these recurrent features don't necessarily tell us the theories are false. It simply says, look, we've kind of dismissed theories of this type in the past, so this is a reason to at least be suspicious of these theories now. Now, there's another version of this which seems to be a special case, which are the recurrent racist conspiracy theories. Those theories which blame the same old group for all the ills in the world. And indeed, this has actually led to a lot of social scientists claiming that there's actually something inherently anti-Semitic about conspiracy theories in general. As a particularist, I don't think that's true. I don't think all conspiracy theories can boil down to anti-Semitism, but I also do accept that there are an awful lot of conspiracy theories that we see in circulation now, which if you scratch them just ever so slightly, you see references to the protocols of the elders of Zion and the like. So there's often features of racism within particular conspiracy theories. You might go, well, look, that's actually reason enough to dismiss those theories here and now. And we often think that the good reason to be suspicious of racist conspiracy theories is simply because these theories are racist. They're not motivated by saying, here's a conspiracy, look, we can now prove these are the people behind it. Rather, it's going, here's my pre-existing prejudice towards a particular group in the world, and I'm using a claim of they're also doing this horrible thing in the background that nobody knows of as reason to further justify or extend my prejudice in a particular way. So we often tend to dismiss racist conspiracy theories because they are inherently racist, not necessarily because they are conspiracy theories themselves. And that's where the hypothetical climate change thing comes in, because unfortunately, even though when we look at anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, we find that there is no basis for believing them whatsoever, it's actually not logically impossible that a group might start conspiring in the future, like my hypothetical climate change scientists. But a bigger problem with these kind of recurrent narratives is often the groups being referred to don't really exist. Now, that's not me saying that the Jewish people do not exist. This is the claim that the Jews, that kind of code word you find in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, they don't exist. The idea of there being a monolithic group of people who are acting with one mind and one intent, that simply doesn't happen. The Jewish people are diverse. They're found all around the globe. They have radically different political positions depending on which countries you find them in. The idea of there being this concerted Jewish conspiracy refers to a kind of a group which really doesn't exist out there in the world, in the same respect that when we start talking about there being a conspiracy amongst climatologists, we are talking about there being a conspiracy which is made up of people in different countries, from different university systems, from different government and NGOs, with access to different funding mechanisms. And the idea of there being a single conspiracy amongst such a diverse and often quite competitive group means that the conspiracy theory is referring to an entity, the conspiratorial group, which really seems to be fantastical in the sense that Yuha and Basham were talking about earlier on. So these are just some of the approaches that philosophers have used to give grounds to be skeptical of particular kinds of conspiracy theories we see out there in the world. And as I've noted throughout all of this discussion, these are not grounds for a wholesale rejection of conspiracy theory or conspiracy theorizing. Rather, they are grounds to be suspicious of conspiracy theories which have certain features, even though to some extent, people do need to go out there and investigate them. So the worry of particularism is actually really more the worry about a naive particularism, the kind of person who thinks that evidence and only evidence is what we need to deal with. Most of the philosophers who are doing work in the philosophy of conspiracy theory are sophisticated particularists. They're going, look, we need to investigate these conspiracy theories, but there are still some guidelines or heuristics we can use to go, some of these conspiracy theories probably aren't worth investigating immediately, when actually maybe there's better evidence for these ones over here we should get round to. Because one of the other issues we have when we start talking about the investigation of conspiracy theories is simply the economic cost of doing it. Most of us do not have the time, nor in many cases the inclination, to investigate the 5 or 6 conspiracy theories we read before breakfast. So we need to have some kind of mechanism to go, I'm not going to be bothered with this particular one. I'm not going to find that one particularly interesting. Oh, now that one has legs. I should actually have a look at that. And so before I finish, I'm going to talk a little about the way that I think these investigations should work. So clever investigators do not alert the people they're investigating that they're engaged in an investigation. And they'll do that in a variety of ways. So Columbo will always appear to be incredibly stupid in order to disarm the person that he's trailing around town for an hour and a half before getting them to convict themselves by an outburst in front of what they think is an idiot. And so the clever investigator of the conspiracy theory does not want to alert potential conspirators that they're looking into their potential conspiracy, because conspirators don't want people to know what they're up to. And in some cases, when it comes to political conspiracy theories, political conspirators may have the power to make evidence disappear, or potentially even make investigators disappear. So the clever investigator wants to make sure that people aren't aware they're being investigated. In the same respect, the clever investigator of conspiracy theories might also be concerned that talking about certain conspiracy theories publicly might inadvertently introduce people to conspiracy theories they haven't heard, leading them to investigate them, thus potentially alerting the investigators, or potentially becoming invested in a conspiracy theory that they probably shouldn't be, but because they don't have the right kind of background or expertise, don't quite see the problem in the conspiracy theories that the clever investigator does. And so we can, and indeed I've been advocating that sometimes the investigation of certain conspiracy theories, particularly conspiracy theories about the origin, transmission, and purpose of COVID-19, might be something we want to do in private, as long as we're able to then produce results that people can look at and analyze. Because what we don't want is some people merely entertaining those beliefs and then finding that their behavior changes subtly, thus making them a potential vector for COVID-19 infection, or a potential person who is going to infect someone else with COVID-19. So I've been advocating for a few years now the idea of a community of inquiry approach, going back to Pearce and Dewey. Another nice example of this is the Citizens Assembly model that you find in the Republic of Ireland. It's to a certain extent a little bit like a grand jury in the US, except that grand juries tend to be a lot more private in the way they give their results, while communities of inquiry or citizens' assembly tend to produce voluminous reports which are able to be analyzed by people outside of the committee. And these are community-led investigations as opposed to government-run solutions, because any conspiracy theorist worth their salt is going to be concerned that if the government is running an investigation and the government is the person being investigated, the government's going to ensure that the result goes in a way which is beneficial to them. And the benefit of this community of inquiry citizens assembly approach is that it's, because it's community led, it's also going to be diverse. It's going to be made up of arch conspiracy skeptics and hopefully also conspiracy theorists, as well as people in between who are going to be able to, in a committee or community investigation find some way to navigate through their particular concerns. Now, they may not end up necessarily agreeing with the output, but you can have minority reports where maybe the majority explains why they came to a particular conclusion, and the minority, as you see in the Supreme Court in the US, also explains their particular reasons. But by engaging in these investigations as a community, being cognizant of the kind of mechanisms that philosophers have engaged in for talking about conspiracy theories and why we find some of them suspicious. These communities can kind of work through things in private, then produce publicly accessible reports filled with data and the methodology used to generate that data in a way of presenting a here's our conclusion about it, and here's a volume explaining exactly why we came to that conclusion. And this, to a certain extent, is going to solve the economic issue that most of us just don't have the time or the broad expertise to investigate these claims on our own in the first place. When it comes to investigating COVID-19 conspiracy theories about, say, the purpose of the New Zealand government's approach towards COVID-19 over the course of 2020, then you need to be looking at both the epidemiological literature, the economic literature, the political situation in the country. And most of us may have expertise on maybe one, possibly two of those topics, but finding an expert who's good on all three is going to be difficult. Creating a committee or community which has enough experts that they can all lend their labor towards that investigation is going to be a lot easier. So I think if we use the kind of mechanisms that philosophers have put forward for explaining why some conspiracy theories can be treated with a certain amount of suspicion, and develop these communities, which ideally should be standing communities which are investigating things all the time, rather than simply erected during a pandemic like COVID-19. This is going to be a really great way to treat conspiracy theories seriously. So to conclude, we might think that there's a problem with particularism, with its evidence first, let's assess conspiracy theories. But it turns out that actually that kind of naive view of the armchair philosopher isn't something which has been adopted by most of the philosophers working in the philosophy of conspiracy theory. There are a few outliers in the literature, mostly generalists who do seem to have a completely different view, but as Pat Stokes has argued, it's actually quite unusual that philosophers have by and large settled on particularism as the way to approach the problem of conspiracy theory here and now. So we can avoid the naive particularism by simply going, look, there are reasons to be suspicious of particular conspiracy theories, even though those reasons still aren't sufficient to say that they are necessarily false. Someone needs to go away and investigate them. I think the most ideal people to go away and investigate them are people in our communities coming together and engaging in a collaborative process in a kind of social epistemic sense to work out which conspiracy theories we ought to believe and why some of them we really can say are unwarranted. Because the answer, as I say, is to treat conspiracy theories seriously, but also treat them carefully. And with that, I will bring my talk to an end.
Thank you, M, for an excellent talk. And we're now going to move to the discussion phase of the event. And the discussion phase of the event actually has two distinct phases. The first will be a panel of experts who are joining us to offer their thoughts and comments on the talk. And then in the second phase, the discussion will open the Q&A period where audience members can submit their comments or questions via the Q&A button for either M, the speaker, or the panelists, or both. So let's turn to the panelist section. We have with us Steve Clark, Charles Pigden, and Brian Keeley, who are also participants in the colloquium series. So I'll turn it over to you guys, and whoever wants to go first, you can just start talking.
I'm happy to go first, but also happy to defer to others.
Well, Steve, as you've started, why not go on?
Why not, indeed? All right. Look, I'm interested in the idea of finding reasons to not have to investigate conspiracy theories, because as you rightly point out, there's too many out there to waste your time on. But I'm just wondering a couple of things. So with David Icke in the alien reptiles, like you say, well, there's no evidence. He claims to have evidence. So he makes the following claims. He says that people have provided testimony that they've seen humans turn into reptiles, alien reptiles, of course, rather than itty-bitty little lizards. He also claims that he saw former British Prime Minister Ted Heath's eyes turn black. And what he's kind of insinuating is that Heath was having some kind of involuntary, re-emergence into his original form or something, and I could just caught a glimpse of it. So he reckons that's evidence. I mean, it's not clear to me that it's not evidence, and I think people's initial suspicion is going to just be to say, oh well, we simply don't believe you. So that's one problem, to figure out what is going to count as some kind of impartial standard to be able to dismiss theories. But you might think, look, there's a whole other reason for investigating some conspiracy theories, which is simply that a lot of people believe them. So with Icke, I've seen the figure 12 million bandied about. 12 million people believe that the world is ruled by alien reptiles. How strongly they believe this, I don't know, but prima facie, that sounds to me like at least some kind of pragmatic reason to go ahead and investigate the matter. Because, if you disprove it and you can persuade those people, surely you're doing them a favour.
Okay, so I will admit that I probably did give David Icke short shrift in my presentation, which is one of those weird sentences you get to say in an academic discussion about David Icke. Apologies to David Icke. I may have simplified your views down, because yes, I have sat through 2 of David Icke's talks, and when David Icke gives a talk, he doesn't talk for an hour or 2, he gives 10-hour talks. So I've sat through 20 hours of David Icke talking about his views. And it is true that if you actually spend time thinking about Icke and his metaphysics, it's actually around about hour 3 or 4 he brings in the alien shape-shifting reptiles. He spends a lot of time priming you to go, look, there are all these recurrent features in world history and symbols we see in different cultures. So yeah, it turns out actually he does present evidence, and I was kind of just using him as a shortcut for an ideal of what people take to be a fantastical version of a conspiracy theory. Icke does do a lot more to actually make these claims, and indeed actually working out where Icke's evidence goes wrong is interesting, because by and large he spends a lot of time saying the most plausible interpretation of these recurrent features of serpent imagery in most cultures is ancient gods. Well, ancient gods can't be real. They must be alien shape-shifting reptiles from another dimension. And so you can kind of ping him for where his inferences go wrong. But yes, you're right. He does present evidence for those views. On the second point of should we just investigate conspiracy theories because people believe them? Yes, I actually think in an ideal world where we've got all the time in the world, all the economic mechanisms, we should just investigate these things. And indeed, arguably, this is why we get so much work in social psychology on these conspiracy theories, because social psychologists are going, why do these people believe claims of X and Y? I mean, there has been a divergence between what social psychologists believe and what philosophers believe when it comes to the warrant of these theories. But yes, I do think it is interesting to look into these theories just because they exist out there in the world. I suppose I'm more motivated here by the fact that most of the time we don't have the ability to investigate every single theory out there. So we need some kind of heuristic to go, look, we can get round to that one eventually, but for the time being, a more pressing concern would be to look into, say, these rather interesting conspiracy theories about cover-ups, about government responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. That seems like the kind of thing we should look at now. And David, we can look at tomorrow if need be.
Okay, so just to clarify, I'm not saying that we should be investigating every conspiracy theory. Let's say there's a threshold of number of people who believe, say it's 10 million people. Just investigate the ones that meet the threshold.
Yep. No, I can also see that too. If 12 million people believe in alien shape-shifting reptiles, you probably do want to find out, why do so many people believe this? Or you might end up going, there aren't that many people, but they're all located in one part of the world. Why is it in one part of the world? So, I mean, for example, David Icke is popular in Canada mostly for his views on crystal healing rather than his alien shape-shifting reptile hypothesis. So he spends much more time talking about alternative health modalities in Canada than he does when he's down here in Aotearoa. And that's also interesting because that to a certain extent indicates that Icke is playing his audience in particular ways.
So, I'd like to jump in, and I mean, I want to hear more about this idea of your committees that are going to do the investigation, because I worry that you may be a bit too sanguine about what these committees are going to be able to accomplish. I mean, so when people do set out to investigate conspiracy theories, or when you have people who attempt to fact check conspiracy theories, at least the track record doesn't seem to be too great, right? That people, if you're committed to a particular kind of conspiracy theory, or even if you're just suspicious of a conspiracy theory, having a gold ribbon, blue ribbon committee come in and say, we've investigated this and we have found this to be misguided in this way or another. I mean, the reaction that you often see is the folks just saying, yeah, that committee was just in on the conspiracy, right? I mean, that's exactly the kind of misinformation you'd expect. And we have the classic example of the Warren Commission, which, investigated the JFK assassination. I mean, the Warren Commission put out a report that was in support of the idea that Lee Harvey Oswald was the sole shooter of John F. Kennedy. And at least for a significant part of the population, that report only made people double down on the idea that Lee Harvey Oswald wasn't the sole shooter, right? That the nature of that report just led people further into the idea that there must be a conspiracy involved. And so part of my question is to think about, like, who's the audience of such some kind of committee of inquiry? I mean, who are you hoping to convince with such a conspiracy investigation committee? And yeah, why do you think we should have much optimism that such a committee would actually be able to convince anybody off of whatever view they had before they encountered the committee and the committee's findings?
Thank you, Brian. That's an excellent question because it does get to the heart of the problem with my potential response. And I'm actually quite glad you brought up the Warren Commission report because, of course, what's really interesting about the Warren Commission report into the death of JFK is the large number of conspiracy theories about the Warren Commission report, right down to it was deliberately engineered to basically produce a particular result by selecting lawyers, journalists, historians, and judges who were going to basically adopt what the government conclusion was in the first place, and then, of course, quite deliberately set the Warren Commission report volumes out in such a way that it would be almost impossible to read it and get a grasp on what really happened there. And the Warren Commission report is kind of what you might take to be the non-gold standard of how you might want to go about investigating a conspiracy theory, because it was set up by the government, and we've actually got fairly good reason to believe it was set up by the government to rubber stamp the narrative the government had already settled upon at that point. It was a commission basically to already restate what people believed. So I would take it that a better way of doing this would be not to generate your committee report with people who are already predisposed towards a particular conclusion, but by drawing from the diverse community of people who believe or don't believe particular conspiracy theories, try to get them to sit down in a room and work things out. Now, you're right that I'm being probably sanguine and overly optimistic that this is going to work. I suppose I would counter that by going, well, it doesn't have to work every time. Even if it only works sometimes, that's still better than probably what we're doing right now. Especially since the evidence first approach that so many people have, which is just hitting people over the head with the "you are wrong because this is what the evidence says," doesn't seem to work at all. And mostly because you do have the whole thing where people are predisposed or have an existing view, and I just simply trying to convince people that what I already believe is something you should believe as well. Well, so as long as there's been some kind of group discussion where people have aired their views, tried to argue for and against, produced reports which may, as I say, have minority reports attached as well, all packaged up and given to the public, people go, well, look, at least they did their level best. Or if they didn't do their level best, you can look at the report, the appendices, the methodology section and go, all right, so they didn't actually look at this thing, or they didn't go into that particular aspect there. So no, you're right. I'm optimistic about this. But I mean, that's kind of the thing about being an armchair philosopher. I can hand wave and go, look, the current mechanism doesn't work particularly well. Can we at least try this thing? And I'm kind of slightly optimistic because the Citizens' Assembly system in Ireland hasn't been ideal, but it actually has been fairly good politically for getting the lay of what the Irish people actually think on a topic and then presenting views to government for them to act upon. So it turns out it's much more effective at getting the lay of the land than governmental-led inquiries in Ireland have been in the past. So there is some reason to be optimistic. But yes, you're right. It is. I am filled with hope, but in this kind of situation, I kind of want to be filled with hope. We want there to be a better system than the one we're currently working with. And I do think a multiplicity and diverse set of actors working together and at least noting down why they got to a particular view is probably better than the so-called debunking efforts that we're engaging in with respect to pernicious conspiracy theories here and now. So yes, that is my armchair response. Charles.
I'm a bit pessimistic about your solution also, mainly because it's a direct democracy solution. Now, the problem with direct democracy, where citizens are just directly participating in something or other, is that it tends to succumb to the tyranny of those who turn up. So whatever it is that you're endeavoring to have a direct democracy solution to, after a while, most people get bored and fed up. And then, the control of the committee tends to fall into the hands of those who are energetic about it. And those energetic people tend to be people who've got bees in their bonnets. It's why, you know, a direct democracy in a trade union is not a terribly good idea. You know, maybe what happens is, you know, there's a small minority, they want to push some line, and they're defeated, there's a big meeting, and then they do it again a week later, unless people turn up. And then they do it again a week later, unless people turn up. So on the fourth iteration, they can get a majority for this crazy thing that they want and nobody else does. Now, that seems to me a problem with you know, direct democracy as a way of solving things. It's the point about elections is that we can get it together to care enough, collectively that is, about who we want every 3 years, but then in between we often get fed up and bored and don't want to pay attention. And I mean, we, you know, that includes me, right? You know, I don't want to be thinking about this stuff the whole time, you know, how we're going to run the society, that kind of stuff. So that's a problem with that. There are interesting examples of this kind of thing which have been relevant to conspiracies. So we've already mentioned the Warren Commission.
If I can just interrupt there, I've suddenly lost all sound. So let me see if I can get sound back, because I suddenly can't hear a single thing which is going on, and I'm not entirely sure why. So I'm just going to turn off these things and see if that makes any difference. So let me just put my. Okay, Charles, can you try talking again?
Can you hear me now?
I can, yes. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, good. Yes. So that's one thing. But there are interesting examples of sort of citizens' commissions to investigate things which were or might be regarded as conspiracy theories. So the Warren Commission, of course, isn't a citizens' commission, and it is very tainted, not because we necessarily think it produced the wrong result, but because, unfortunately, it was going to produce that result whether it was right or wrong, because we do know that LBJ was pressuring the committee to come up with the result that they came up with, not because he thought that was the correct result, but because he was afraid that it wasn't the correct result. He was worried that Kennedy had been assassinated by a Cuban-led conspiracy. If that were the case, he might be forced to declare war on Cuba, which might lead to World War III, which he didn't want. So it's far better from his point of view if we all agree it's a lone gunman. And the same thing, and Catherine Z. Olmsted makes this point in her book. Ed J. Edgar Hoover, as the director of the FBI, also wanted this result because his whole shtick was he had this enormously effective anti-communist organization designed in large part to detect and foil communist conspiracies. If a communist conspiracy has successfully managed to murder the president of the United States, that means he had been falling down on the job in a truly colossal way. So it was in his interest to say, oh, well, it's a lone gunman and we couldn't possibly have done anything about that. So we know this about the Warren Commission. It's very tainted, even if it actually produced the correct result. But the other interesting ones that occur to me are, which are much more like citizens' committees, are the Bertrand Russell Tribunal with respect to the Vietnam War, which was investigating American war crimes in Vietnam, which were, of course, being covered up. So it's kind of investigating, it's investigating things which are partially conspiracy theories. And the Dewey Commission, which investigated, which was a counter trial of Trotsky. Trotsky had been tried in absentia in the Soviet Union in the trial of the rightist Trotskyist bloc, and had been convicted of, anti-Soviet espionage, wrecking, etc., etc. And so what Trotsky did was he said, right, I've been accused of these things and convicted. I'm going to organize a counter trial. And he got people who were, not too closely associated with him to be on the commission, but weren't, on the other hand, weren't like, Soviet patsies, and repeated the accusations against him, and then developed a defense, and was acquitted by the Dewey Commission. The problem was, how effective was that at exculpating Trotsky in the eyes of anybody who wasn't a committed Trotskyist? Well, I guess if you were a big-time fan of Dewey, and perhaps didn't know how much Dewey was under the influence of Sidney Hook, who at that time was a Trotskyist, you might be influenced. Or you might, if you read all the way through the report, because it's pretty exhaustive. But, I'm not sure how successful it was at really clearing Trotsky in the eyes of the people he wanted to clear himself to, namely, the left generally, and particularly Stalinists. So that's another example. And again, how effective was the Russell trial, Russell Tribunal in the end? I mean, you might think now most of what they said was correct, and they were at least along the right lines, but how many people did they really influence at the time? I think that's quite a moot point. So I'm a little pessimistic about citizens' commissions. One, direct democracy tends to be degenerating to the tyranny of those who turn up. Two, the examples that we've seen of this, something like it, the Dewey Commission and the Russell Tribunal, weren't, I think, all that effective in either proving the conspiracy theories that in the end the Russell Tribunal was in favor of, or disproving the conspiracy theories that the Dewey Commission was designed to assess. Of course, in disproving the Stalinist conspiracy theory, they were in effect providing evidence for the Trotskyist conspiracy theory, namely that Stalin had and his Confederates had conspired to fake the trials, but that's another matter. Yeah, so I'm sorry to be so pessimistic, but I'm
not sure. Charles. So I'm glad you brought up the Warren Commission report, because sorry, not the. I'm glad you brought up the Dewey Commission report, because as you know, I use the Moscow trials in my work a lot. And one thing I do like to note when I'm talking about the Dewey Commission is that Dewey hated Stalin. He had very visceral views on Stalin. So it was almost a commission that was designed to show that Stalin had to have been behind a conspiracy to render these trials as false, because there's no way Trotsky could have done the things according to Dewey's own views, and as you say, that of his mentors as well. So let me go back to the first point about how direct democracy has the problem that, as you say, it gets rendered to the tyranny of those people who turn up. And you're right, one of the problems for this particular mechanism that I've been talking about for a few years now is how exactly we get people involved and we keep people involved. In many respects, whenever I think of this, I don't really think of it in the modern sense of the way that we engage in the democratic process. I think more of it as the way the Athenian assembly worked back in the day. So you had your calendar months. A certain subsection of the population was expected to be in assembly at that time. Change the month, new population comes through. That was meant to be designed to ensure that no power blocks developed in the Athenian polis. Of course, long term, we all know exactly what happened to Athens anyway, but the design was there to try and get people involved throughout the year, was also not having the same people being involved every single time. It turns out once you get demagogues involved, it doesn't really matter if you're swapping people in and out, if they've got shared leaders or shared leadership, you can control what goes on from one month to another. So I am attentive to this particular issue. I also don't know how you solve it, because arguably no one's worked out how to solve it as of yet. It's one of the problems we face in deliberative democratic democracies at this time. So yeah, I mean that is a reason to be pessimistic, which also goes into what Brian was saying as well. And yes, there is a long list of communities of inquiry or citizens' assemblies, which look on the face of it initially to be quite good, but then when you read into it, you find out that the most motivating factor behind it was actually askew in the first place. And as we both know with the Dewey Commission report, it's basically 20 years before anyone's actually willing to fess up and say, oh, you got us. So I mean, it's really when Stalin dies, it's Khrushchev wanting to distance himself from the sins of Stalin, who admits that, oh, you know, the Dewey Commission was right, and I was in no way involved in any of the things described there, even though actually he was quite heavily involved at the time. So yeah, I mean, the history is not good. The mechanism is suspicious as to how we can sustain and keep it, which is why in the last wee while I've thought maybe the other route to take, which is to not have these standing committees or citizens' assemblies, is to include the kind of analyses that we have for spotting when theories might go slightly wrong, thus justifying suspicion of them, and making that part of the toolkit that's taught within critical thinking within schools. So we want to get it in at a very early age, because all the pedagogical literature indicates you want to start critical thinking teaching at a young age, so to inculcate that in students and make it a lifelong part of the way that they analyze things. And maybe a better use of our effort would be to try and bring this stuff into schools in the hope that we can then train properly suspicious students who are skeptical of what their political masters are saying all the time. Although I can also see, if you think there's a conspiracy going on, or just we don't really want you looking into the bad things we do, there's going to be pushback by government on oh, you don't need to teach those schools. Keep that for your critical thinking courses at university. It's fine if they learn it once they've got past the voting age.
Could I just chip in with a story about my daughter, when she was about 4, concluded that Santa Claus was real, right? Now, she was suspicious of the Santa Claus story because, you know, obvious reasons, but she rejected the theory that he wasn't real, because that would have involved a huge conspiracy on the part of adults to lie to children, and she couldn't work out why they might have wanted to do that. So she rejected it as an implausible conspiracy theory. It's about 4 or 5 that they were all lying, and consequently she adopted provisionally the hypothesis that Santa Claus was real. But that's an interesting case. You know, that's someone employing the right kind of skeptical thinking that we're in favor of, right? You know, you don't believe conspiracy theories if the group is not sufficiently cohesive to conspire. Well, are adults sufficiently as a group sufficiently cohesive to conspire? If there isn't some benefit they could get by conspiring, what motive do they have to lie to children? But, you know, she was wrong.
Actually, that actually is a nice point, because one of the things that came out of the conference I was at the beginning of this week on what's happening on social media with respect to dismiss and malinformation is the idea that actually you also have this kind of weird Manichaean thing going on in a lot of our discussions. So most of the people studying social media and the way it spreads online have turned into Hobbesians. we've got a really dark view of exactly what's going on, and we want the state to intervene and regulate immediately because you just can't trust the social media giants to do anything properly. Well, the social media giants are all Lockeans. Okay, so no, humans in their natural state would never be deceitful. They'd never lie to people. It's governments which are causing these things. And so your view on human nature, and I kind of applaud your daughter for going, why would adults lie to me about these things, is going to change your frame of reference for these investigations as well. And maybe that's the next big issue, is to work out, so what view of human nature should we have in this debate? And what one should we be instilling in people? Should we be instilling in people a Hobbesian view because we should never trust people in power? Or should we go, we kind of want people in power to be virtuous, so maybe suspicion is the kind of thing that drives that kind of behavior in the first place. So yeah, it's a tricky road that lies ahead.
Is it okay, panelists, if I open up a question from the audience at this stage? There's a couple questions in the Q&A, and I thought I would try to fold two of the questions together from two different of our students, Adam and Raven, who are asking like related questions to the topic, but what about the people who believe the conspiracy theories? And so one question is, what about the character of the person, including their emotional, psychological states, their personal histories? How much can that play into suspicion about the conspiracy theories themselves, the amount of social connections they have, their own personal traumas? And a related question, which I think has the same theme, there's people are quick to refute all of the factual claims about the coronavirus and its effect on people, but also quick to accept ideas and some of the conspiracy theories, like that it's a China hoax. And are there factors like degree of education that determine who believes conspiracy theories and who doesn't? Is there any evidence about the decision-making processes involved for this type of individuals? So I wonder if you could, anyone on the panel, or M in particular, want to say something about how you deal with the psychological profiles or characters of the believers of the theories rather than the content of the theories themselves.
Well, I'll take a first stab at this. So in part, what's problematic for philosophers to answer this particular question, and that's really a question about the social psychology of conspiracy theorists. And so one, we're not social psychologists, we're not kind of doing that work. And also there's kind of a line in the sand between the views that social psychologists have and philosophers have at the moment. Most social psychology is fairly generalist in scope. When it comes to talk about conspiracy theorists, they take it the conspiracy theorists are typically irrational or believe false beliefs. Most philosophers are going, well, actually, a conspiracy theorist is simply someone who believes in a conspiracy theory. Given that conspiracy theories are sometimes warranted, we shouldn't generalize about the character of people who believe these things. So it's a little bit difficult to talk about the character stuff. I have a paper called The Problem of Conspiracism, where I try to unpack this discussion by looking at whether we can generalize about the general character of this person called the conspiracy theorist, or whether we're dealing with a kind of misrepresentation, fallacy there, that we're taking some notable examples, your Alex Joneses or your David Icke's, and then assuming that everyone who believes a conspiracy theory looks and acts like them. And my argument is that no, that's probably not the case, because of the general definition of conspiracy theorists that we have operating in the literature. And also it's just uncharitable to take it that because there are some notable weird examples, everyone is going to be somewhere towards the weirder end of the spectrum. I do think that when we're talking about why people might be motivated to believe conspiracy theories, philosophers can be involved in that conversation, because it's fairly clear that in some cases people are motivated to believe in conspiracy theories because they have been primed in a particular way to have beliefs about the existence of conspiracies in their communities. And the example I like to use is I lived in Romania for a year and a half. Romania has a very corrupt political system. Romanians suspect conspiracies are going on all the time in their polity because they are. The government engages in cover-ups, collusions, and conspiracies quite a bit, and Romanians are justified in being suspicious about conspiracy theories. And depending on your standing, which might be as grow up in a particular country or grow up in a particular community or belong to a particular ethnic group which has been marginalized and oppressed in the past, including, say, medical misadventure or conspiracy, that is going to prime you to be more suspicious about certain types of conspiracy. So I think philosophers can be involved in that kind of prior probability discussion about what influences the kind of evidence you put weight on when you're trying to judge whether you should be suspicious a conspiracy is going on or not. Who else wants to throw in on that?
All right, well, maybe we'll turn to the next question if that's okay. So Adrian asks about the connection between conspiracy theorizing and scapegoating. She notes that a lot of conspiracy theories are made, or they're often made to place blame for unfortunate events on particular groups. And do you think there's anything to the idea that conspiracy theories place blame? Because right now in America, in the last day or so, there's a lot in the news now about attacks on spas in Atlanta based on their ethnicities and maybe connected to the China hoax. And do you see any connection there, reasons to be investigating conspiracy theories on those grounds?
I mean, yes, I do. I do. So I think sometimes conspiracy theories get used politically to deflect blame in one direction and appropriate blame in another. So it's kind of notable that the person who's really, really insistent that people refer to COVID-19 as the China virus or Hong Kong flu is former President Donald J. Trump. He's really insistent people are using this language all the time, despite the fact that there's little evidence of that being widely adopted across the population as a whole. And you might go, well, that's the president, the former president of the United States, although some conspiracy theories claim he's still the president and Biden's some kind of sock puppet. Using the language of conspiracy theory to deflect blame from the previous administration's response to COVID-19. And so, yes, I think you can use conspiracy theories politically in a way to go, well, this is actually a really great way to distract from our own issues by simply using the language of conspiracy theory to blame someone else.
Can I comment? There's this is part of what Popper said in his writings on it. What he wanted to say was that many of the bad things that happen in the world are not due to anybody's intentional action, or that's not quite right. They're not intending to produce the bad thing, even if it is a result of their intentional action. Lots of the really terrible things that happen in the world happen as a result of invisible hand mechanisms. Each person is pursuing their own private agenda, and as a result of the interaction of these individual projects, something really bad can happen. But nobody wanted that bad thing. Right? And what Popper says is, well, that's, people find this psychologically unacceptable, so they prefer to think that a bunch of powerful people have conspired to deliberately bring about the bad thing, like the Great Depression. That would be a prime example. Now, and this is true, right? This is true sometimes. But that's the thing. It's only true sometimes. Sometimes bad things happen as a result of invisible hand mechanisms, and sometimes they happen as a result of conspiracies. Although people who are too prone to believe conspiracy theories may be suffering from this desire to find a specific person to blame when something bad happens, when there might not be people to blame, at least in the right kind of way, that doesn't mean that that's happening all the time. This is part of the problem. Yes, some of the things that people say about the psychological mechanisms influencing people to develop bad, unwarranted conspiracy theories are true. Among them, this scapegoating mechanism. But of course, sometimes bad things happen as a result of conspiracy. You can't say, it's always invisible hand mechanisms. The person who almost says this, bad things are always the result of invisible hand mechanisms, is a famous Better Angels of Our Nature. What's his famous Harvard professor? What's his name?
Steve Pinker.
Steven Pinker.
Pinker, yeah, Pinker. Okay, Pinker quotes Springsteen's lyric, I got a job working in construction in the Johnstown Company, but lately there ain't been much work on the account of the economy. And he says, this is great. We've got a rock lyric which is displaying the right kind of sophisticated thinking. The person isn't blaming capitalists or Jews for bringing up about this bad thing. He's saying, well, it's the complex economic forces, which I don't really understand. But as a result of this, there ain't going to be much work. And Pinker says, this is great. This is, us having a more sophisticated political culture. Well, yeah, but yes, but things sometimes do happen as a result, bad things do happen as a result of conspiracy. Or even if it's not a conspiracy, there are invisible hand mechanisms at work due to the incentive structures which people have deliberately set up. So, it's a more complicated explanation. You just can't say, oh, well, no one's really to blame here. No, sometimes there are people to blame. And even in its invisible hand mechanism, there can be people to blame in the sense that if we changed our projects, if we change the private projects we're pursuing, which bring about this disaster, then the disaster might not come about. As, for example, climate change. What people advocate essentially is we change the behaviors that we are engaging in, which collectively produce a result which we don't want. But there's still a question of it being the fault of those people who are engaging in those behaviors. So the thing is about these psychological mechanisms is, yes, they are real, but they're only operative part of the time.
Thanks, Charles. Maybe if I could combine two more questions from students that sort of piggyback on what was just said. One question is, are certain conspiracy theories generally geared towards a specific group? And I think I would also highlight that because I don't know if that's the kind of claim made by Gassam in his recent book on conspiracy theory as a criticism of conspiracy theories and as a generalist criticism. Another question a student wrote that's related to that question is whether there's just a kind of disposition in human nature to push fault off on others. And the question is that why we turn to conspiracy theories? Why must we always find someone at fault? Why are we uncomfortable with the unknown, meaning things just happened as they are through some hidden hand, maybe, or something like that? Anyone want to take that up?
I'm happy to have a go, but maybe MRX Dentith would like to try first.
Okay, yep, I'll try and give a nice short answer. So, I mean, it's the thing about recurrent conspiracy theory narratives, which seem to rely upon blaming the same old group for the same old problems, often do seem to be kind of related to the history of the place you're in. So there's a long-standing set of conspiracy theories in Aotearoa, New Zealand, blaming our indigenous people, the Maori, for all kinds of social ills or crime, etc., etc. And so often these are actually more the result of political interventions by people in the political class finding convenient scapegoats to then allow justification for doing particular things. So I kind of often think that these aren't often promoted as sincere conspiracy theories. They're kind of used against people with existing prejudices. And I suppose part of the problem here is that there might be a human tendency to want to attribute blame rather than accept that sometimes things happen for no particular reason. But the problem is sometimes things happen because people intended them to happen. Sometimes people really do engage in conspiracy. And maybe if there is this kind of hyper attentiveness towards intentionality, and this is now we're getting into terrible evo psych explanations there, maybe that exists because we do need to be attentive to the idea that sometimes people are responsible. I mean, you might be concerned that people overact or act upon unduly mere suspicions, but sometimes you are suspicious because there is something suspicious going on in the background. Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's a very hand-wavy answer, but it's because it's such a big problem. Steve, what are you going to say to contradict me on that?
No, I'm not going to contradict you. I'm you're a very suspicious person. No, I was actually going to say in support. Look, I mean, I've done a fair bit of work with Rachel Powell on tolerance, and one of the things that the psychological literature just says about tolerance is that we're systematically more tolerant of people who are like us than people who we perceive as being different in race or religion or linguistic group or whatever it is. And, you know, this sort of is related to suspicion of them, that humans have an innate tendency to be tribal, and we can overcome it. So Rachel Powell and Alan Buchanan have done a lot of work on this idea of moral progress, where they say we can overcome these tendencies, but under pressure we tend to fall back into tribal thinking. And when we do, we're going to think more conspiratorially about our groups. That just seems to be part of how we functioned. And look, there may actually be evolutionary reasons for this, that particular threats back in the day, mostly from other human groups. So this is just something very deeply ingrained in our nature that we have to work to try and overcome if we're going to live in a modern liberal tolerant society.
Yeah, no, very good point.
Another thing I'd say about this is thinking of it in terms of invisible hand mechanisms, and I distinguish between invisible hand mechanisms where, you know, it's people planning a whole bunch of different things which collectively produce an unintended effect, and hidden hand mechanisms where it's basically a conspiracy, right? So hidden hand isn't the same as an invisible hand, right? Okay, so we have one reason people quite like conspiratorial explanations, wrong ones or dubious ones, is the hidden hand mechanism sheets responsibility for the bad thing that's happening to the individuals whose projects are bringing it about. And that often means that the bad thing is happening is because each of us are doing things which collectively lead to the bad result. And people prefer to believe that, no, it's not what I do or me as part of a group, because after all, I don't want this bad thing. No, it's some other bad person or group of bad people who are doing this. The one that occurred to me, it'll be a comic example for most of the audience, but there was a discussion about citation practices in philosophy on one of the philosophy blogs. And basically the complaint was, all these bad old philosophers are not citing all these young philosophers, and consequently, they're not getting jobs, people aren't paying attention to their work, and so on and so forth. And it's all really, if only these famous philosophers would, start looking at the young talent, everything would be okay, or at least better. Right? That was the idea. So the fact that the citation statistics are like this, there's a small number of people who get huge numbers of citations and a great number of people who get hardly any citations at all, right? And it was bad old philosophers who were doing this. Well, no, it's not. It's everybody. It's everybody, because more is produced on any given topic than anybody can possibly read. And consequently, we all have to be selective. How do we select? We select people's work to read that we have reason to believe is going to be useful or interesting. And that's going to be people we've heard of. And so there may be many people who are producing as good work, but no one pays attention to it. And it's each person's choice as to what to read and what to cite that's bringing about this result. And it's no evil conspiracy by bad old philosophers neglecting the young. That's not what it's all about. That was an example of people not being happy with an invisible hand explanation and looking for an almost conspiratorial explanation. It's not that these bad old philosophers are getting together and saying, we're not going to read the young. It's just they're just bad, right? So it's not quite a conspiracy theory, but it's people being unable to accept an invisible hand explanation and wanting to blame the bad behavior of a particular group. I think that happens quite a lot, and that's sometimes what happens when there's an invisible hand explanation for an effect, and you like to blame a particular group of people who then you're tending to think of as conspiring. Because if it's not them, it's you, right? All these young philosophers complaining about not being cited are not being cited because of things they themselves do. And, that's an intolerable thought. So people are enormously resistant to this invisible hand explanation. So one of the things I like to stress, because I lecture on philosophy, politics, and economics, is that there are hidden hand explanations and invisible hand explanations. They're both important factors in explaining what goes down in society. Maybe the tendency to take an overly conspiratorial view of things is indeed due to this hyperactive, what's it, HADD? HADD. The idea is that human intelligence has evolved to
Hypersensitive, Charles.
Hypersensitive.
Sensitive agency detection device.
Yes, that's right. I keep forgetting it. Yes, and the idea is that human beings have evolved in a competitive, cooperative environment where it's really important to understand the mentalities of those creatures you're acting with. I say creatures because when this begins, we're not really human, right? And so our intelligence is geared towards recognizing beliefs and desires, and we just overdo it. We just overdo it. So we read more intentionality into things than is often really there. That's the thesis. And that could be an explanation of what's wrong with those people who are too prone to believe conspiracy theories.
Okay, listen, this has been great. I think we should probably end here though, because we have our Antipodian and Kiwi friends who need to get breakfast, and our students here in Minnesota need to go to bed pretty soon. And so the good news is we'll meet again a week from today on March 24th at 7 p.m. for the third installment of this series, where Steve Clark will be the lecturer. And again, we'll have a panel, and again, you'll be invited to ask questions if you come as an audience member. So thanks to M, and thanks to the panelists for a great session. Thanks to the people who showed up and the attendees, and we'll see everyone in a week.